Thank you so much for that introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you, and it's a pleasure to have the chance to talk about important work that we can do in improving student outcomes. I'm sorry I'm not with you in person today. I've had the pleasure of visiting your beautiful country 3 different times in recent years and hope to get back soon, but I'm pleased to be able to talk to you virtually. And what I'm going to do today is share a story of institutional transformation, talk about how we can flip the script and deliver more holistic and proactive support for students, and share with you some of the outcomes that follow when we're able to do this. So without further ado, I will start sharing my screen. Give me just a minute to get my presentation up and going. And so let me tell you a little bit about my home institution. It may seem, and it is, a half a world away geographically, but it has a number of parallels to some of the circumstances you're dealing with in South Africa. We're a large public university. Georgia State University has 52,000 students. We run 6 campuses in the metro Atlanta area. The reality is Georgia State had not been well known historically until the last few years, mostly now known for our student success work. Before that, our greatest claim to fame was probably our geography. We have the very uncommon distinction of having our main campus in downtown Atlanta bisected by a National Park Service historic district. The Martin Luther King Historical District cuts our campus in half. I'm talking to you this morning in Atlanta, just a few blocks away from the brick building at the bottom of the screen. That's Ebenezer Baptist Church, where the Reverend King was head pastor, as was his father before him. His gravesite is located right here within a few blocks, as is his childhood home, which is pictured at the top of the screen. So we're living and working every day at Georgia State in this geography that is infused with historical significance. But the reality is, for much of our history, Georgia State did not live up to that legacy. I pulled these photos from the Georgia State Photo Archive. This is what Georgia State University looked like when the Reverend King was doing his Nobel Peace Prize winning civil rights work. We were whites only, a segregated campus well into the 1960s. So the sad irony is the Reverend King was preaching and working a couple blocks away from an institution that was the embodiment of what he was fighting against. And even much more recently than the 1960s, Georgia State was still grossly underperforming, especially for our students of color. So these are our bachelor's degree graduation rates as of about 20 years ago. Only about 30% of our students were graduating, and we were a poster child nationally for equity gap. So year after year, semester after semester, our white students outperformed our Black and Hispanic students. Our middle and upper income students outperformed our low income students. It was just the way it was. We became complacent to accept that as the way it had to be. And what makes Georgia State's story hopefully instructive, maybe even inspirational for your purposes, is that what's happened demographically at Georgia State since these numbers were locked in 20 years ago would not suggest that Georgia State would be the site of a turnaround. For one thing, we've been getting a lot more diverse. When I arrived as a junior faculty member out of Princeton to begin teaching here at Georgia State, it was still at that time a majority white institution. In fact, 75% of our students were white when I first began my career at Georgia State. About 15 years ago, we flipped the script. We became what is labeled in the United States an MSI, a minority serving institution, meaning over half of our students identify as non-white. And as you can see from this chart, we've just become more and more diverse every year. So it's the case now that over 80% of our students are non-white. There's no majority demographic group any longer at Georgia State, but our largest single group now are African-American or Black students, around 40% of the student body. Now, obviously, this kind of demographic shift across the U.S. does not typically correlate to significantly improved graduation rates, nor does this one. The other demographic change we've gone through at Georgia State over the last 15 or so years is our students have gotten a lot less well-resourced financially. So this is the federal designation for low-income students in the United States. These are students who qualify for a grant program called the Pell Grant Program. And before the last recession, so talking about 2007, 2008, under a third of our students at Georgia State qualified as low income. We more than doubled the number of low income students we enroll in a 5-year period, to the point now where it's around 60% of our students. This term at Georgia State, we're currently enrolling about 30,000 low income students. And it's not going to be business as usual. What we love to do in higher education, it's certainly true in the US, and I know from my visits to South Africa, it's been true in South Africa, is to create a lot of targeted programs. So you have a challenge with first generation college students or low income students or students from a certain demographic group, and you create a particular program or intervention for those students. At Georgia State, where our demographic shifted so radically and so quickly, that option didn't make sense. You know, you can create a program if you have 300 or maybe even a couple thousand low-income students, but you don't create a program for 30,000 low-income students. You have to change the way the institution acts at its core for all of its students. Just change the general operations of the institution for all students. And if there's one difference between the approach I'm going to be describing to you this afternoon and the approach we've most often seen in higher education, it's just that what Georgia State worked on was re-envisioning the experience, not for particular demographic groups, but for the entire student, changing the norm as opposed to adjusting the exception. A couple other details before I get into that transformation. Just to clarify, Georgia State University has not been getting more selective in our admissions criteria over this time period. I think some of you know the main college admissions exam or university admissions exam in the US is the SAT, and our SAT scores are actually down over the period I'm going to be describing by about 30 points. We're also not doing it with greater amounts of resources from the state or any external body, that our state appropriations have been cut severely during this time period by about 70 million US dollars. So under these circumstances, and you may be going through similar experiences at your own institution, it's easy to point fingers, right? We'll begin to improve our student outcomes when the state stops cutting appropriations and gives us more resources, when the secondary schools provide us with better prepared students academically. What Georgia State did about 12 years ago, quite publicly, was ask a different question. Are we the problem? If 7 out of 10 students are coming to Georgia State dropping out with no degree, most of them dropping out with debt, taking out loans to finance their education, you know, whose fault is it? Yes, it is the case if we had more resources, that would be helpful. It is doubtlessly the case if the students came to us better prepared academically, that would be helpful. But what we began to realize is there must be some things that we're doing that are contributing to the attrition rate of 70% of our students. Why don't we focus on those things? Those things we have some control over. And if we find a problem in the things that are under our purview, we have a path forward to correcting them and serving our students better. And that's just what we did. We got much better with the data, as I'm going to share with you, understanding the specifics of why students were leaving Georgia State. But what we did with that data is really put the mirror to ourselves and focus on the ways in which we were complicit in these attrition rates. We then used the data team to pilot new approaches to supporting our students, to address the problems we had identified. And when we found something that worked, as I've just been mentioning, we scaled it across the whole student body. It just became the way we did things at Georgia State. So what I'm going to do this afternoon is share with you just 3 examples. There are more I could share, but I want to share with you kind of an approach that I'm commending to you, a methodology. In each case, I'm going to start with a data point, which quite frankly is embarrassing. It illustrates the way we were underperforming, serving our students very poorly, in some cases as recently as 5, 6, 10 years ago. And then I'm going to say for each of those 3 examples, how Georgia State used data to offer more holistic and better supports for students in the particular area that was identified. So the first example is this one, 19%. As recently as 7, 8 years ago, 19% was what is called the summer melt rate at Georgia State. I'm not sure if summer melt is a term that's used in South Africa. It refers to the students who, between their secondary school or high school, as we call it in the US, high school experiences, and the beginning of university, change their mind about going to university at all. These are students we admit to Georgia State, confirm their intent to enroll, come to orientation, register for classes, but the semester begins and classes start and they're nowhere to be found. And this is not a small number. By 2015, this number had reached almost 20% of our incoming confirmed first-year class. So we wanted to understand what was happening to these students, literally a fifth of the students that we were intending to enroll. So we used the data to track them. We looked at all the students who were scheduled to begin at Georgia State in the fall of 2015, and we used national data to track them for a full 12 months. Did they end up at another institution? Did they go to a rival university? Or, what happened to them? What we found was disturbing, that 12 months after they were registered, admitted, and ready to start at Georgia State University, there were almost 300 students who hadn't attended a single day of post-secondary work anywhere across the US. They had just melted out of the college-going population. And you're looking at the demographic profile of these students, mostly non-white, mostly low income. These are the students we need to succeed with, and I mean we collectively, not just in the US, but in South Africa. But even before the first day of university, they're getting disproportionately excluded from the university-going population. So the next thing we did with the data said, okay, what do these 278 students have in common? What happened to them that led them to not enroll after all? And you won't be surprised by the answer. It's not that they woke up some morning as a collective group and said, we got through high school, we took the placement exams, we applied to university, we got into university, we put down a deposit, we registered for classes, and then we just changed our mind. That wasn't what we discovered. What we discovered is that what linked these students together was their failure to navigate the bureaucracy, the administrative tasks that need to be completed to be ready for the first day of classes in the United States. Things like filling out financial aid forms, sending in transcripts, putting down deposits, taking placements exams, registering for classes, and so forth. All of these administrative tasks were hindering one or another of this group to the point where the entire group was prevented from matriculating because one or another of these tasks failed to be completed. And when we looked at the data more closely, what we found is that not only were these administrative tasks blocking students from proceeding, but they were disproportionately impacting our minoritized and our low-income students. So we were contributing to the equity gaps by the administrative burdens we were placing on our students. So we made two changes for the next cycle. This would have been 2016 admission cycle. One thing we did is we created a portal. The portal takes the students through those different administrative tasks one by one. It's color coded, so when they complete a task, it changes colors. There are resources on the site to allow the students to get help and so forth. The biggest advantage of creating the portal is it greatly improved the data that we have about our incoming students. We used to know a student was engaged, and then we just stopped hearing from them. Now we know a student was engaged or a particular student was engaged until we asked, for instance, for their immunization records, and then we stopped hearing from them. So it allows us to reach out with much more targeted and personalized help for the students. In fact, the collecting of this data over a couple cycles has led to significant changes in Georgia State policy. For instance, one thing we do now is contract with a mobile health clinic, and it parks outside of every orientation and is available on the spot to give free immunizations to students. Because we found it didn't do any good to tell a student on when they were here for orientation, oh, you need to now figure out how to get immunized for measles, because they didn't have the resources or context to solve the problem on their own. We found it costs us about $60 for each free immunization, but it's more than worth it. It's the morally right thing to do, and it also has been a favorite of our chief financial officer, because we invest $60 in the student, and then they're coming back and paying tuition and fees for the entire semester. So this was one change we made. The second change we made, and this has gotten more attention, is we became one of the first schools in the United States to scale the use of AI, artificial intelligence, in coaching our students. So we set up a a chatbot, a AI-enhanced communication platform to answer the questions of our incoming students. What we found is they were a particularly vulnerable group because they weren't yet on campus with us, so we couldn't reach out to them physically. They didn't tend to, and most 17, 18-year-olds don't pick up the phone when you call them. They didn't answer emails. And so we were we knew we could help them get through the administrative obstacles, but we weren't getting good access to them. So we became one of the first schools to use AI to help. We created a knowledge base of over 2,000 text-based answers to questions commonly asked by incoming students about financial aid and immunization and all the questions students have. And we worked with a vendor to put it on a smart device. So this is not an app students log on to. They just go onto their texting platform and begin a conversation with Pounce. That's the panther, our school mascot. And from that point forward, they just go onto their device and they can ask a question 24/7. The AI uses algorithms, it uses natural language algorithms to understand the text-based question that comes in and pull the right answer out of the knowledge base, or make a determination there's not a reliable answer, in which case the AI delivers the question to a staff person who writes and vets a response and then adds it to the knowledge base. So the platform's constantly getting smarter. It has now over 4,000 answers in it. So we launched this in May of 2016, which is about 4 months before the start of our school year in the end of August, beginning of September, thinking maybe for our new students, we'll have 5,000 or 6,000 questions answered. In those 4 months alone, just for our first year new university students, we had over 185,000 exchanges. Average response time when a question came in from a student was about 6 seconds. Interesting evidence in the data. The use of the chatbot was heavier at 12 midnight and 1 a.m. than at 9 or 10 in the morning, which tells you something about our business practices, right? We're not always there when the students most want us to be there. But it also indicated we were beginning to reach a group of students we weren't reaching at all in the past. A lot of our students, about 80% of our students have jobs, complicated lives. Many of them have children or have caregiving responsibilities for siblings or parents and so forth. And it's difficult to find the time to deal with these administrative issues at 9 or 10 in the morning. But after the kids are at bed or after you come back from your job at 10, 11, 12 o'clock at night, the students were getting these issues resolved. We also did focus groups with the students that first summer to say, okay, what did you like or not like about this new AI tool? And most of the students were very, very positive about it. But one of the sobering things we heard is a number of students told us that they asked the chatbot questions they wouldn't have asked a human being. If you can't get your financial aid forms completed because you don't have access to your father's taxes because you haven't seen your father in the last 2 years, the last thing you want to do is go into some stranger's office and spill your family's personal history to that stranger. The students knew it was a bot. They liked the fact that it was impersonal. They didn't have to feel embarrassed or judged, and they could ask it any question they would like. And did it make a difference? These are 2 changes scaled across the whole students. All the students. Did it make a difference? Made a huge difference. We've been able to drop summer melt at Georgia State from 19% to 9%. And the students haven't gotten any more savvy about administrative tasks. We've just gotten more proactive in providing the support that students need. Because it works so well for our incoming students, now every Georgia State student has the tool, the AI tool, available to them from the day they matriculate to the day they graduate. And what we've done through a number of randomized control trials is show that it's helped significant numbers of students complete all kinds of tasks like their payments and getting forms in on time and registering for classes in a timely way and coming to see advisors when they need to and so forth. And more recently, because it's worked well for our incoming students and it's worked well for our continuing students to help them deal with administrative tasks, we've been using it in high enrollment classes. We work with the instructors to seed the knowledge base so that the AI can answer content questions about the course. And then we also use the chatbot to nudge the students. So a week before an exam, we might say, your instructor has a couple sample questions. Have you studied enough? Are you prepared to answer questions such as this and so forth? With this intervention in high enrollment classes that enroll 8,000 or so students throughout the academic year, we've seen an improvement in final grades of 7 points on a 100-point scale. And for first-generation students, the gains are even stronger, closer to 11 points, even though the tool is the same for all populations. The second of the three examples I'm sharing with you this afternoon starts with this data point, that about 10 years ago, 12 years ago now, the average Georgia State student was going through 2.5 majors, academic fields, before they graduated with their 4-year degree. And when we looked at our data, we again came to the conclusion that we were the problem. At Georgia State, we offer degrees in 86 different fields. We offer 115 academic minors. We offer certificate programs. Every semester, we offer about 3,000 courses in total. And we would bring students in to the university and ask them to pick some career, pick some kind of major, pick 4 or 5 classes. They would pick, but it was obviously without any real grounding or understanding, especially as our student body became mostly low income, mostly first generation college students. So we changed the way that we onboard all students at Georgia State. Now they start their first semester, if they're a new university student, in a block schedule learning community. They're in a group of 25 students that travel in all their first semester classes together. We can't afford to cap enrollment at 25. So in some cases, the students are mixed in with much larger lecture halls and so forth, but they'll have 24 familiar faces. They develop partnerships, friendships, study groups, and so forth. Just from that structure of registering the students in a more organized fashion, we saw improvements in first-year grades and in first-year retention rates. But to deal with the issue of students bouncing between academic fields or majors, we began to organize all these learning communities around meta majors. So we don't put pressure on students as they come in to pick among the 86 different fields that we offer. We try to find a general area of interest. If a student is interested in business, we find 24 other students who are interested in business and put them in a community together. That allows us to shape the courses the students take, but it also allows us to target programming specific to that group. So our business academic departments will have open houses. The students will meet the faculty in marketing and finance and risk management and so forth, so they get a better understanding of what these fields are. We'll bring in alumni panels so that in the first semester, the students are getting better grounding in the academic choices in front of them. We're using data to help the students make more informed choices about their academic fields as well. We use data scraping tools to scrape websites like LinkedIn to find what's happening with current Georgia State alumni. And we have websites like the one you're looking at for every major at Georgia State. This is for political science, but it shows what Georgia State University political science alumni are doing. What organizations are they working for? What titles do they have? What are their salaries and so forth? So if a student's thinking, do I want to go into political science or sociology? We actually have some information live and up to date that they can use to help make that decision. And then to get our faculty involved, we have a program where if a faculty member teaches an introductory course in any field at Georgia State, they can get a seed grant to create an assignment in the course where the students are compelled to think about the career competencies they're learning in the class. So the example on the screen has to do with American history. Our American history faculty got together. They give students in the course now a primary data set of historical data. And one of the assignments is the students have to learn data visualization tools and how to show an external audience the significance of the data set via these visualization tools. So all told, we have about 150 courses now that have embedded in them these assignments that have students thinking about career competencies. Does all of this make a difference? Again, it makes a big difference. We've been able to lower students bouncing between different academic fields by about 1/3. So students are finding what we'll call the right fit major earlier on in their academic field. Well, what does that have to do with equity and graduation rates? It has everything to do with these matters. What has happened as we've helped students streamline the pathway to their degrees is that they're accumulating fewer wasted credit hours as they work on their degrees. We've cut, in effect, a full semester off the average time it takes a student to complete a bachelor's degree, and that's greatly reduced the cost of a degree at Georgia State, where many of our students have to take loans from their very first semester to fund their education. The average debt has gone down for every one of the last 7 years at Georgia State. So when people ask me, how have we got to the point where our low-income students are graduating at the same rates as our middle and upper income students, which is true and has been for 6 years now at Georgia State, they sometimes think you must have raised a lot of scholarship dollars to pull that off. And that's not the case. What we've done is make it a lot more efficient for all of our students to complete their degrees. The third and final example I'm going to share begins with this data point. About 12, 13 years ago, we were losing about 6,000 students a year to attrition. These were students who were academically qualified to re-enroll at Georgia State, but they would be enrolled one semester and not the next. And it was very difficult to understand why they weren't coming back. They were hard to contact. They didn't tend to respond to phone calls and emails. So we engaged in a big data project. We looked at 10 years of Georgia State data, 2.5 million Georgia State grades, 140,000 student records. The point was really simple. Could we find in the historical data any recurring academic behaviors that correlated in a statistically significant way to students dropping or flunking out at Georgia State? What were students doing 6, 12, 18 months before they drop out? The idea was if we could find early indicators of a student who is about to drop out, maybe we could intervene and prevent them from dropping out in the first place. We thought maybe we'd find a couple dozen statistically significant indicators of students who are going to drop out. We found 800. And for over 12 years now, we've been tracking every Georgia State student every day for every one of these 800 risk factors. We're obviously not doing it manually. As we update our student information and other data systems, we're able to identify any of these behaviors. And when one is identified, a staff person is notified the next morning, and they've got 48 hours to reach out to the student with some kind of intervention. Now, 800 risk factors is overwhelming. What I'll say, having done this for 12 years, is that there are a few significant risk factors that have proven to be the most important ones. And a lot of them are very intuitive. So we know that students are more likely to succeed in their courses if they attend classes, if they're engaged. And it's even more true of our online courses, making sure that the students are engaged. But we had trouble collecting attendance in the past. Now we're using our learning management system from the first day of the semester to track which students are failing to log on. If after a couple days, as soon as the first week of classes, a student is not engaged electronically, we're reaching out to that student proactively to see if we can help. Do they need technology help? Are they having some personal or financial issues? Let's identify it before the students fall out. We're looking at grades in a predictive way. So the predictive analytics look like this. We found, and I'd be surprised if it's not true for your students, there's a strong correlation between the first grade a student gets within their academic major and their chances of graduating on time. So on this chart, if you look in the center, what it says is at Georgia State, if a political science student gets an A or B in their first political science class, they're graduating at above a 75% clip on average. But if they get a C in that first class, they're graduating on time at a 25% clip. What have we done historically with those C students? Really nothing. We just passed them on to upper level coursework where they would struggle and 75% of them would drop out. Now we're intervening proactively as soon as that C grade is recorded. We'll sit down with the student. We'll look at the papers and exams. Maybe there are reading and writing issues that need to be addressed. Maybe the student's working 40 hours a week and we need to figure out a better student work balance and so forth. But let's try to figure the problem out before the student leaves. Once the student leaves, it's going to be very difficult for them to complete their degree. The trick is to do this at scale. Over the last 12 months, we've had over 100,000 interventions with our students. Sounds like a lot, but it's about 2 interventions per student at Georgia State. Based on alerts coming out of the system. We didn't correct all 100,000 issues, but I can say, 10, 12 years ago, these were 100,000 issues that were going completely undiagnosed. Students were underperforming in prerequisites, not engaged in their classes and so forth. We were expecting our first generation low-income student body to have diagnostic powers that we lacked. We finally now are taking some responsibility saying, let's help our students through what is a very difficult pathway to getting a university degree. As soon as we launched this program in 2012, we saw significant improvements in retention rates. maybe one of the most surprising things we've seen, because some faculty feared if we use predictive analytics and probabilities to advise students, students would end up taking the easiest courses and majors, is just the opposite has happened. Because we're identifying problems so early on, we've seen a huge growth in the number of students at Georgia State graduating in STEM degrees. Not because more students are declaring STEM majors, but because fewer students declaring STEM majors are wiping out early in their studies because they can't complete the prerequisite courses. And the biggest gains have been for the student populations, the demographic groups that struggled the most in the past. Overall, what is the impact of using predictive analytics to advise our students? We just completed a 6-year independent evaluation with a nonprofit evaluator out of New York City. And they came to the conclusion that it's improved our graduation rates at Georgia State by 7 percentage points overall and by 15 percentage points for our Black students. Not, again, because the Black students are getting a special sort of intervention, but by holistically identifying problems early on, our Black students are benefiting the most from that approach. So what I want to do in closing is just talk a little bit about what happens when we scale these kind of holistic, proactive supports across the whole student body, not just individual demographic groups. Well, one thing that's happened at Georgia State is it's changed our financing. The way financing works in South Africa, I know, is very different, but I also know that there have been lots and lots of financial pressures on South African higher education. So what's happened is we calculate every 1 point we improve our success rates with our students, it allows us to generate about $3.3 million in additional tuition and fee revenues every year. In the time I've been describing to you this afternoon, we have not improved these numbers by 1 percentage point. We've improved them by 25 percentage points. So we're talking about $75 or $80 million annually of additional revenue that we're pulling in. Of course, we're not doing it, and we weren't motivated initially by the finances. This is the main motivation. Despite the fact that, as you saw over the last decade, we've doubled the number of low-income students we enroll, we've doubled the number of students from minoritized backgrounds we've enrolled at Georgia State, we're graduating every year 3,500 more students, an 84% increase. But the biggest gains have been for our Black, our low-income, our Hispanic students, the students who are doing the least well before we launched this new systematic approach. Again, to say it, not because you've heard me mention one time that there are special programs for our Black, our low-income, or Hispanic students. All of the interventions I've described are for all students equally. But when we began to serve our students better systematically, the students who benefited the most were the ones who were struggling the most under the old administrative burden. And because the rates have improved disproportionately for some populations, it's changed our graduation rate profile dramatically. So our graduation rates have not improved incrementally, they've improved exponentially. We're talking about doubling, in some cases almost tripling the graduation rates for certain demographic groups. And we've had 7 years in a row where our Black, our Hispanic, and our low-income students have graduated at or above the rate of the student body overall. So if you're an incoming student to Georgia State, your race, your ethnicity, your income level doesn't predict your likelihood of success. We also are a national leader in what is called social mobility, taking students from the bottom quintile of Americans by annual household income as they matriculate at the university and moving them to the upper half of Americans. We're ranked among one of the top universities in the US by multiple metrics and standards. And this institution in the shadow of the Martin Luther King district that was segregated into the 1960s and still grossly underperforming for our Black students as recently as a decade ago, now, and it's been for 6 years in a row, confers more bachelor's degrees to African-American students, to Black students, than any other college or university in the US. The good news is that these approaches that I've been describing to you this afternoon are highly transferable to other institutions. I'm now directing the National Institute for Student Success. We're actively working with over 100 partner campuses in the US to implement these evidence-based, data-informed approaches to proactively support students. One of the first groups that we worked with starting about 2.5 years ago was a group of 7 institutions you're looking at here, including 3 historically Black colleges and universities. What has happened in a 2-year period is that on average, they've improved their retention rates, the success rates of their students, almost 9 percentage points on average. To put that in some perspective, the national change across the US over the same time period has been about 0.8 of 1 point. So it's literally 10, 11 times faster improvement for the campuses making these kind of changes. And what we've seen across these partner campuses for the National Institute is the same thing we saw at Georgia State. All the students benefit, but the students who benefit the most are the students who were struggling the most in the past. So it is good news that white students across the 7 campuses that I just highlighted are succeeding at rates 5 percentage points higher. That's well above the national average. But look, for Black and for Hispanic students, those improvements are 11 and 13 points. So these sorts of ideas, it's not that there's something special about Georgia State. They're very common sense approaches, and they can be implemented over a relatively short period of time. So the very last thing I'm going to say is just a little bit about why all this matters, kind of put a little personal spin on why this work is so important, even though it is work. It's going to take effort to make changes and do some fundamental things in a different way. One of the things that happened as we began to get better reputation nationally for what we were doing with student success is we began to have some visitors. And a few years ago, you may recognize the gentleman on the right there. That's Bill Gates. What was interesting about Bill Gates' visit to Georgia State is that we didn't invite him. He really invited himself. He was doing a keynote on World Health in the big convention center downtown. And a few weeks beforehand, his people contact us. They say, oh, well, Bill's been reading about what you've been doing with data and technology to help low-income students. Would you mind if he dropped by for a couple hours? And yeah, we said we would allow Bill Gates to drop by and talk to us. And, he came, he stayed for 3 hours. It was wonderful. He sat and played with the predictive analytics, worked with the chatbot and so forth. The highlight of the visit was he wanted to meet some of our first-gen students who were in their first year of studies at Georgia State. So we rounded up a group of students, and they showed him, kind of what it was like to and not only be at Georgia State, but experience some of these approaches that I've been describing to you this afternoon. And that event underlined me why it's so important that we scale these interventions broadly across the whole student body rather than just limiting our efforts to targeted efforts by demographic group. Because looking at that picture, you may not guess which student was probably the least likely to have made it to Georgia State University and to be sitting there beside Bill Gates. But it was almost surely this student, Austin, the redheaded kid. Austin came from a very low-income family in rural Georgia. His father was in the Army as his career, and when he was decommissioned from the Army, he ran a fruit and vegetable stand. So already by U.S. metrics, Austin had very little chance of making it to Georgia State University. But the odds became even higher when he hit middle school, because at that time, his father was diagnosed with ALS. And I think most of you know, a fatal a disease. And it began a very stressful period through 8th grade to about 11th grade, where Austin had to come home immediately after school because he had younger siblings. His mother had to go to work because their only income at this time was her retail job. And he was watching his siblings, but also caring for his father, whose health was descending very rapidly. In fact, he tells the story that he to this day, he's one of the most careful drivers he knows, and is one of the most gradual brakers when he puts the brake on a car, because his father's health was declining. But one of the last things his father wanted to do is teach Austin how to drive. And Austin was so careful in driving because he didn't want to cause his father any pain. So sadly, his father died when Austin was in 10th grade, again, making the chances he's going to make it to university even smaller. But amazingly, despite all those obstacles, Austin not only got into Georgia State University, he got a state scholarship to cover the almost entirely his tuition costs. So he was a great student. But a couple months before he was ready to start at Georgia State, he got his first bill from the university, and it was thousands of dollars more than he had anticipated. And like a lot of first-generation students, his first reaction was to blame himself. Oh, gosh, I'm so stupid. I didn't really figure out this. I thought it was only going to be a few $100s, and it's turning out to be thousands of dollars I owe. He says he was even embarrassed to tell his mother because he knew she didn't have the thousands of dollars he would need to enroll. But luckily, Austin was onboarding to Georgia State the first semester we had launched our chatbot. And although he was embarrassed to tell his mother and he didn't raise his hand to us, he got on that chatbot and tried to figure out why he had miscalculated his bill in such a dramatic fashion. And what he found out is that on one of the financial aid forms, his social security number, his ID number had been, some digits had been transposed, wrongly entered, and the scholarship that he deserved and would get wasn't appropriately applied to his account. So he found this all out through the chatbot. He was so happy that even though it's very easy to pay your bill electronically, and what he had to pay was just a very nominal amount, he and his mother came down physically to campus to stand in line at the bursar's office to pay, to make sure that there was no mistake this time and his bill would be paid. And he says, as he was standing there, his mother was in tears, so proud. And what I'll say is, it's those stories that we need to keep grounded in, because every time we make one of these changes, what we're talking about are people like Austin, whose trajectory in life hinges upon a very fragile set of circumstances. And we have some control over those circumstances. We have some power to redirect and help. And we live in such divisive times, and it's very hard to find consensus on some issues. But I think one thing we can all agree upon is the world would be a far less welcoming place if, those students had stood there that day to take this selfie with Bill Gates, but Austin hadn't been there to be in the picture. So what I'll say is, you have more power than perhaps you give yourself control for, credit for. That we think that a lot of the disadvantages that our students face mean that they're intractable, and mean that we're going to have to see the same kind of inequities in post-secondary outcomes. And if there's any message you take away from Georgia State, it's that doesn't have to be true. That our students come with all kinds of inequities from U.S. society, all kinds of learning loss and unequal resources and so forth. But what we found is we have a lot more control over changing the trajectory and being able to deliver to our students and the families the promise that we have so long offered at the university level. So thank you for your attention this afternoon. Thank you more for the work you're doing on a day-to-day basis on behalf of students. There are a few things more important that you can do today. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I know we've got about 15 minutes for you to make some questions and comments. So let me stop sharing. I'm happy to address any questions.
Well, thank you, Paul, for that. That was amazing. I think let's open the floor for questions. I'm sure there are some. Yes.
Thank you, Prof, for your presentation. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I'm a researcher in student success myself, and I've cited your work plenty times. I just want to know, when it comes around to, predictive analytics and harvesting historical data to identify patterns in student success, how does one go about that? And I don't want to say ethically, I think that's but for lack of a better word, ethically, because, we have the Copy Act here, which regulates our personal information and what we collect, and whether students are privy to the information that we're collecting from them and then comparing them to historical data. So how does one get about that, around that, in an institution like the University of South Africa, where we have over 360,000 students? How do we get around those data issues?
Yeah, it's a great question. The ethical dimension of this work is very significant and weighs heavy on my mind. I'll say that you heard in the introduction, my degrees are in religious studies. I'm a professor of religious studies, and my subfield is ethics. So we've tried to shape these programs to be very ethically compliant. As in South Africa, the U.S. government has very strict data rules. We have a national policy called FERPA, which very much protects students' data. So a couple things to say. One is that the fact that we are tracking students for 800 risk factors every day does not mean that we're tracking them via personal data sets that are different than the data we were collecting beforehand. That what we are using for our predictive analytics are just the data sets we not only have always collected about our students, but need to collect in order to be an accredited university. Their grades, their attendance records, their registration records, their major, their time to degree, all the sorts of things that registrars have long collected. That's the basis for our system. We're not tracking personal behaviors. We're not entering into our predictive analytics any demographic data. So whether a student is Black or white, whether a student is low income or high income and so forth, those are not part of our predictive analytics at all. What we're really trying to do with that approach is see what academic behaviors correlate to students struggling. So for instance, we have two students taking exactly the same math class, and both students end up with a C grade in the math course. What the predictive analytics have showed us is that the chances of those students graduating may be very different. If one student, for instance, is an English literature major and this math course is the only math course they need to take, perhaps the C grade that they just got in the course, which is a passing grade, obviously, it raises their likelihood of graduating. If the other student sitting beside them getting the exact same C grade is an economics major and needs to take additional math courses, but in upper level economics courses do all kinds of high level math, that C grade indicates a high degree of risk and tells us we should be helping that economics student right now before they attempt other economics courses and so forth. So the reality is there is data involved, definitely. All that data I just described is data about our students, but it's not personal data other than what we are collecting to academically serve our students and being able to award them degrees and so forth. So often the assumption is, well, aren't you replicating prejudices that are kind of inherent in the data if you're looking at students by different demographic groups and so forth. And our view is what we want to do is equip our staff with actionable items, actionable issues. And the staff person doesn't have any control over whether a student is upper income or low income or Black or white, but they do have some control over whether this particular student needs tutoring in math at this particular moment. So let's set up the predictive analytics to provide that kind of information.
Thank you, Prof. Appreciate that.
Sure, my pleasure.
Good question, sure. Yes, sir. I think move a little closer. Sorry? No, just move closer.
Professor, to what extent do you balance throughput versus the relevance of your programs, right? Because if you're seeing this exponential increase in graduates, are they finding work? Maybe you can talk about tracking that as well, that relationship. Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. So the question is about the outcomes after they leave the university in careers and work and so forth. And I did share one slide, but admittedly, it was a fairly brief part of the presentation. But I'll say this, that our students at Georgia State are some of the lowest income students in the region. So that's the student population we serve. And it is not the case when they graduate, they earn on average as much as students who go to very elite institutions like Harvard. We're very close to Georgia Tech. Georgia Tech is a couple miles from it. That institution admits a very different profile of students. And when those students graduate, they earn more on average than Georgia State students do. What Georgia State is exceptional for, and I pointed out we're in the top 1 or 2% in the US among all US institutions, is in social mobility, in taking students who, as they enter the university, are in the bottom quintile, the bottom 20% of Americans by annual household income. That's a huge proportion of our student body. And then moving them 10 years later to the upper half of Americans by annual household income. So quite literally upper income 10 years after that. And by that measure, Georgia State is among U.S. News and World Report, which just came out a couple weeks ago, and some of you know as a ranking service, put us this year at number 14 in the United States in social mobility, with 4,000 students, 4,000 institutions overall being ranked. So the frank reality is the best predictor of what a student will earn after graduation is initially the income of his or her family prior to matriculation, that there's a strong correlation early on, but as students graduate with university degrees and the further they're off in their careers, the greater the receding of the difference between upper income and lower income students is, and Georgia State students are very successful in their careers by that measure.
Thanks for that, Prof. Any other questions? Ruth?
Yeah, thank you very much, Prof, for that brilliant presentation. I first of all want to appreciate the fact that, you know, as an institution, you could look into your practice and to, you know, clearly face the fact that as an institution, you have some challenges, if I could put it that way. Because when we talk about student support, which many institutions, even in our context, is not paying much attention to, you know, we don't focus on the institutions per se. What we rather talk about, because institutions tell us about how much they are spending on student support and how much, what facilities are in place. But I keep asking the question that, what evidence do we have? To what extent do we know if our students are actually accessing those forms, those structures that we have put in place? And that comes back to what you have said, because if your institution never went back to the drawing board, you wouldn't have been able to identify that the problems actually lie, you know, with you as an institution. So mine is not a question, it's a comment, which and I'm just saying that how I wish as institutions will be able to go back to the drawing board to see if we have a poor students rate, throughput rate. What is wrong with us? We ask ourselves that question. Why are students, for instance, not accessing the student support structures that we put in place, despite the fact that, you know, they are there? So institutions are not asking the right questions. And I think that is a big challenge for me as a researcher. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you very much. That was very well said, and I agree that we too often blame the students. They're not showing up, they're not getting the grades we would like, and so forth. And what we saw at Georgia State is a lot of the problem was ours. I mean, the headline here is we're graduating 3,500 more students than we were a decade ago every year, even though by academic credentials and test scores and so forth, we should be graduating fewer. The students haven't gotten more savvy. We've gotten better at supporting them. And what we've really tried to do in essence, and it's the heart of your comment, I think, is the model has always been for universities to say, we have the help if you need it. You know, there's tutoring, there's this support, there's that support, there's somebody who will help you. What we didn't realize enough at Georgia State, and I think some of your institutions are suffering the same challenge, is that the students who we most need to help don't necessarily have the bandwidth or the context to access the help when it's made voluntary. You can say we've got support available for you at 3 o'clock on Tuesday afternoon, but if students are working and overwhelmed and have family obligations and so forth, they cannot access it. So a lot of what we tried to do, and it's true of all of the examples I just shared with you this afternoon, is hardwire the support into the experience of all students, not make it voluntary or optional, but just say, okay, if you're coming into Georgia State, you're going to be on that chatbot. It's available. You know, you're that's the way you're going to communicate and so forth. If you're in your first semester, you're going to be in a learning community, and you're going to be in programs that help you pick majors and understand academic careers and so forth. And once you begin taking your courses, we're going to be tracking you for these risk factors and reaching out for you. It's not that the students have to opt into any of those things. It's just the way we do things at Georgia State. And that's closed the divide between the haves and the have-nots, because too often the resources were only being accessed by the most empowered students.
Maybe one more question or comment? Yes.
It's me again, Prof. Sorry, I just wanted to ask, do students who register for the first time at the university, do they have an option to opt out of being tracked and their data collected for the purposes of predictive analytics or not?
It's a great question. They do have an opt-out option, but what we have to explain to them, and it underlines the answer to your first question, is they can opt out of being tracked by predictive analytics, but they can't opt out of us tracking any of the data that goes into the predictive analytics for the reason I explained earlier, because the data going into the predictive analytics is just the data we need to collect in order to be an accredited institution. We need to know what courses you're registered for, what grades you're getting, what your major is, what your minor is, what your, when you're going to be graduating. So those are all the data that contribute to our predictive analytics. And of course, we can't tell a student we won't track those data because then we couldn't award them a degree and so forth. So we can say we won't reach out to you with alerts and all that sort of thing. But most of the students, not most, all but in 12 years, a couple of the students understanding that equation have no trouble with it. Our students today, my view is, are used to being tracked in lots of ways, right? They're not surprised when they go on a website and hit on a certain button that the next day they're going to get targeted ads and so forth. What we're doing at Georgia State, one, is so much less intrusive than that, and two, is so much more altruistic in its benefits, right? We're not trying to get profits out of our students. We're trying to help them achieve a goal that they came to us and said they want to achieve, and recognize even with 100,000 proactive interventions, we have 50,000 students at Georgia State. So it's about 2 times a year. 2 times a year, students registering for the wrong course or struggling in a class, and somebody's reaching out with very personalized, proactive support. What has changed most dramatically is in our exit surveys of our graduating students, they have reported they feel much better supported by Georgia State. They feel that they're cared for better, that there's somebody who cares for them, even at a time where we've used technology more. But because it comes across and it is personalized and supportive, the students receive it in that way. So we really have not had any pushback from the students that this is an invasion of privacy. And I don't think it is, because, as I say, it's all based on data that every university collects.
Thank you very much, Prof. Yeah, sure.
Mine is a quick one, and it really goes to your last comment now, as to whether or not you see a long-term relationship building as a result of your exit survey. So do these students, or what percentage of them, are actually retained for any post-grad calls that you offer, and the success rate thereof?
Yeah, it's a great question. In all frankness, even though these programs are about 10 years old, seeing some of the longer term impacts, there's still data to be collected. What I will say is this, that we know anecdotally that some of these programs have created much stronger early alumni support and participation. So the group of students who have graduated from Georgia State within the last 10 years are much more likely to be in contact and so forth. What we hear a number of the students saying, and it's an important lesson for us to remember, is even though technology is behind some of these interventions, that the students are getting more timely, personalized help than they ever did before. In the past, we were overwhelmed and we were ignoring these problems. So the students are feeling the university as being more supportive throughout their time period. I didn't talk about it this afternoon, but we have a grant program, for instance, that the students don't even have to apply for. We're tracking data to show when a student is at risk of dropping out for financial reasons, and we give them these micro grants, and the students are they're kind of blown away. Oh, I didn't know anybody cared that much that you were watching, and I didn't even have to apply, and you were going to give me this money and so forth. So some of these things have really helped, but it's going to be another decade or so before we can see, does this really impact long-term connections with our alumni?
Yeah. There's a lot to think about. But Prof, thanks a lot for your time this afternoon. Really appreciate that. I think we can give one more hand.
Yeah, thank you all. Appreciate your time today. And again, I hope I get to see you in person sometime soon, but thank you so much for the hard work you're doing on behalf of the students of South Africa.
Thank you very much. And thank you once again for your time. Bye-bye.
Bye.